because it'll damage the catalytic converter. That's why they took it away. That was a bitchy tool too. Hit it, cut out cylinder 1. No change in RPM. Cut out cylinder 2, RPM drop. Cut out cylinder 3, RPM drops. It was a great way to find a dead bolt. Can't do it anymore.
Well,
Now,
weak one too.
yeah,
The weak
we found a way to get around that on the Detroits. You just take a screwdriver and hold the injector down. But then Detroit, one of the Detroit reps was in the shop at the time. He said, "No, you don't want to do that. You just voided the warranty on your." Oh man, I think we all have fun. Okay. Same thing with spark ignited motors. You don't want to run one of these buses with a coil disconnected, because all that fuel that should have been combusted is now going straight into the catalytic converter, and it does not like that. Okay. So the oxygen sensor monitors the voltage levels of the sensor to determine concentration of oxygen in the exhaust stream. If the voltage levels are increasing, the mixture in the exhaust is becoming rich. Likewise, if the voltage decreases, the mixture is becoming lean, oxygen rich. If the voltage levels fall below a predetermined threshold for the sensor, the concentration will display lean. You can actually look it up on some scanners. It goes rich, lean, rich, lean, rich, lean, rich, lean. Or you look at the O2 sensor voltage, 0.3, 0.7, 0.4, 0.9, it varies. And that's good. If it's stuck at a particular voltage, that means you have an O2 sensor issue or a wiring issue. Okay?
I've seen them get slow too, like really slow.
Well, as they get old,
Yeah.
kind of like me. Just saying. Okay? So you can tell who wrote this. During motoring, that's light load cruising. We call it cruising in America. They call it motoring in England. Oh, he's motoring down the boulevard. It sounds so nice.
Motorway.
In America, it's like, we're cruising. Right, we're out looking for trouble. Cruise night, right. So during motoring conditions, the three-way catalytic converter becomes saturated with oxygen molecules running slightly rich. Running slightly rich allows the catalyst to recover more quickly. We consume the oxygen. Hydrocarbons entering the catalyst, triggering the oxidation, allow for reduced NOx. Following motoring, that's when the thing's most inefficient. That's why diesels and engines these days don't like to idle. They're very inefficient on the emission side of the house. Okay. So chemical reactions after motoring can increase the cat temperature. So if I'm motoring down the highway, and all of a sudden I encounter an incline, and now I've got to increase power output of the engine. Now that it's running more efficient, the cat has to recover so it can create its oxidation and reduction, so it's going to run a little hotter because it's got all this excess oxygen in it, and it's got to recover from the motoring. I just love that word, motoring. I can just see the little British guy with his cap on driving his MG. I had a British petroleum engineer in college for my earth science class. This guy was cool. His name was Nigel Hancock. And he had the little hat on. He had the little MG. He was about 80. His wife was 29. I don't know how he pulled that one off, but it's good to him.
American,
No. Very British. Nigel.
Did you do the pinky in the air?
Nobody was always smiling.
What goes bad on these oxygen sensors? Is there a way to-
Usually they get coated with something. Or like, how some people would spray like brake clean or ether down the tailpipe or down the intake to check for exhaust leaks. That's not good on O2 sensors. But oil. What was that? Yeah, that's usually because to get the vehicle's emissions in compliance as soon as possible, they preheat the O2 sensor. Okay, that's what they call it, a 6-wired sensor, because 3 of those wires is for the heater. And when the heater circuit goes down, it takes that thing quite a while to warm up and start actually functioning. And until the O2 sensor comes online, the vehicle is what they call open loop. It's not receiving any feedback, and it's not responding to any feedback. Now, if the O2 sensor becomes damaged, depending on the vehicle's programming, it may start looking at coolant temp to realize when it's hot and to go into closed loop. Okay, but then when it does that, if the O2 sensor is defective and it goes into closed loop and looks for input, it's going to get bad data. Then you'll get the diagnostic trouble code, O2 sensor data valid but above normal range or below normal range or erratic. Okay, so that's usually what fails on them. Okay, and when you're putting in an O2, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, try not to handle the oxygen sensing element because the oils in your hands are enough to take the sensor out. Usually when you're putting in an O2 sensor, your hands are grimy anyway. And be careful on whatever Teflon or anti-seize you use, probably anti-seize, because if you use the wrong kind or you get anti-seize on that sensing element, you've just wiped it out. No bueno. And they're not cheap. What's an O2 sensor for a Volvo?
For a Volvo, you're talking diesel?
Well, what's the most expensive one?
Like $386 for the Volvo. It's a NOx sensor. NOx, they call it on the Volvo.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Now-
Now, a crazy test for that too. The engine would rev up real high, and it would go through all these changes. You would hear the timing change.
Yeah, because it's looking for a response from the sensor.
And then you know what it would do at the end? The first time it did it, it freaked me out. It revved it all the way up to like 2150 to the rev limit, and then it just
Dropped.
stalled while it was up there. Like just cut the fuel and spun down.
And then,
so
and
in
then
that
turn
spin
itself
down-
back on?
Yeah, well no, it just spun all the way down till it shut off. And in that spin down, what it's doing is pumping fresh air through the engine and looking for the change at the NOx sensors.
Yeah.
So it was crazy.
Yeah, if you weren't expecting that, I can see why you
I
did
wasn't. I freaked out. I was like, what'd I do?
Yeah, I broke it. So if I were to hook up a scanner to my engine and look at the pattern produced by the O2 sensor, you would see something like this. That's the O2 sensor oxygen pumping. Ideally, I'd want to keep my O2 sensor input to the ECM at 4.5 volts. That means I'm running at what they call lambda 1, which is stoichiometric, which is the perfect air-fuel mixture that would produce a complete burn, meaning no leftover debris. Obviously, we're never going to get that. But if I did this, and I just ran a flat line, my tap wouldn't work because I wouldn't be getting the oxygen necessary for that second oxidation chamber in the converter. So what the O2 sensor does, what the ECM does, is it constantly richens up the mixture, leans out the mixture, richens up, leans out, so on and so forth. This is called fuel trimming. There's a whole class on short-term and long-term fuel trimming. I don't have time to get into that. That's a great class though. Scanner Dan has a 1-hour video on troubleshooting using fuel trim. It's freaking awesome. He's got a book, it's out of stock, but I think I'm gonna buy it. It's a great book. I watch his videos. The guy's kind of a little, he's cool, but he's high strung. You know, unlike me. I've heard that, birthday girl. Oxygen sensor voltage range is 0 to 1 volt. This means you're running at your optimum air-fuel mixture, neither rich nor lean, but we can't do that. It takes about 15 seconds now with the preheater to get this thing warmed up. Okay, and this is what your sensor looks like. That's a used one, obviously. And it's usually as the engine wears, the oil starts saturating it, that's what takes it out. Your readings start to drift and go out of calibration, then you start throwing codes. Your engine performance suffers. Now, our engines have 2 O2 sensors. We have one before the catalytic converter, we have one after the catalytic converter. What do you suppose the second one does? Primarily. What do you suppose the second one does? Yes, Jeff in the back row.
Well, nobody else?
No, nobody else.
It checks on the cat function.
Checks how the cat's doing, not the one at home, eating the sofa. Who's the cat person here? Who's got the, like, how many you got?
One.
Is he big?
It's a baby kitten.
Had a friend of mine pick one up at a shelter. Turned out to be a baby lynx.
Oh, wow.
Here, kitty, kitty, kitty.
Oh, they name it Bobcat.
Oh man, imagine her surprise about 9 months. That was a big cat.
Wow.
A big cat. A lynx is about the size of a large tomcat, right?
Wow.
But it was, she domesticated it, it was cool. And when she said she had a guard cat, I'm like, she wasn't kidding. You ever get tangled up with a lynx? Don't. Will not go well for you.
Is it legal though to keep?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think they're an endangered protected species, but hey, if you can get away with it, have at it, man.
I'm just thinking if somebody was to come into her property and the animal would attack.
I'd say that animal might show up in your bedroom and not you say anything at all. That's right. I haven't fed her in a
Major
week.
lawsuit right there.
Usually
If you
they,
live long enough to zoo.
usually they are hiding in the daytime.
Yeah. Now, my second O2 sensor is going to look at how well the catalytic converter is performing its chemical reactions to take my exhaust compound coming directly out of the engine and change it into the third compound leaving the cat. And the second cat is going to look at how much oxygen is coming out of the catalytic converter. Because that's the key to that converter's operation is oxygen, right? We remove it in the reduction chamber and we add it in the oxidation chamber. So if the oxygen coming out is not within spec, because the ECM and the engine manufacturers know how much oxygen should be coming out of the catalytic converter if the engine is running properly, if the timing is performed properly, if the fueling is performed properly, and if the catalytic converter is performing properly, the OEM knows what's coming out of the tailpipe. And to verify that, it's going to put another O2 sensor. Now, they may or may not be the same one. They may be slightly different in design, they may not be, so you have to check. Before you just start, changing them over. The second cat is going to usually have a high level of oxygen reading coming out of it. Concentration should remain, let me back that. It should remain slightly rich if the cat's operating properly. Slightly rich. And it should be relatively small in its adjustments up here. Okay? If it's not, if it's doing this, like the first one, that means the cat's not working. And you'll get a code.
P0420.
Probably,
The
yeah.
one everyone dreads.
Yeah.
AutoZone sells a fix for that.
What's that?
AutoZone sells a fix for that.
And what might that be?
Spark plug depowers and capacitors.
Yep.
What does that do?
It pushes the sensor further away.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I know. It's like a sleeve. Yeah, I had one in my Chevy when I was burning oil on my number 7 cylinder.
So when I went back to the small guy, he's like, did you take it out? What'd you do?
That's just kicking the can down the road. But if it gets you smog, get you registered. Yeah.
The gamers are doing it. Everybody on the forums, they're doing that. The 18mm ones from that.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, we have the near zero engines. You probably got them over Santa Monica. Okay, that's kind of a misnomer. What it is this. And I'm going to go through it quickly, then we'll get into ignition system. Back in the day, not so long ago, in a land not so far away, we had road draft tubes that as the engine crankcase vapors increased, it would go down the tube and just spew it out on the highway. That's what they did, right? The old two-stroke Detroit. You know how you knew when they were out of oil? They stopped leaking. I'm not lying, am I?
Drip Troy.
Detroit, brought to you by the framers from Harley Davidson. Because that's how you knew when a Harley needed oil. It stopped dripping. Same thing with Corvairs. You own a Corvair, didn't you? Oh, okay.
You find a parking spot too.
Want all the oil.
Because I don't want the back end slide down on
But that's a
a big over.
that's a real bad leak. So what we did, like I'm part of this, right? The incumbents called me and said, Mike, how do we fix this problem? I said, wrong guy. We're going to take and recover the vapors from, run them through a filter, and then reintroduce them back into the inlet side of the turbocharger. So whatever vapors is coming out of this crankcase is going to be filtered and put back into the inlet of the turbocharger. Is this performance enhancing? No. We got these vapors, we got to do something with them, we can't let them down the road draft tube. Oh, I know, let's just stick them back into the inlet side of the motor. That's what they did. Okay? So, the raw oil is put back into the crankcase. If I got raw oil dripping out of this thing, I just reintroduce it back into the crankcase. Okay. I have a little sensor on top of my valve cover vent that reads pressure. And if the pressure starts getting high, I'm going to throw a code. Okay? 556, data valid but above normal range. 555, data valid but below normal range. That means there's a restriction somewhere in my closed crankcase ventilation system. Okay? So there is the filtering element. Okay, and it has coolant through it to prevent it from icing up because there is a mild drop in temperature. Now, for us here in California, that doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. But if we mess with that, we are messing with a federal emissions control device. We can't modify it. Well, let me rephrase that. We're not supposed to. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
So you guys don't run the centrifugal ones?
I don't know what's that. I don't think it is. Okay. So here's where my vapors go, back to the inlet side of the turbocharger. So it comes off my filter housing. I got a big hose that runs in front of the engine, and it goes to the inlet side of my turbo to be reintroduced back into the airstream. This isn't necessarily tailpipe emissions. This is just crankcase emissions. Okay? It has nothing to do with the catalytic converter, has nothing to do with the O2 sensor. It has everything to do with crankcase gases that we normally let escape into the environment. Now we can't, so we have to do something with it. So we take the vapors and we simply reintroduce them back into the air inlet stream and reburn them. Okay? On the liquid oil that comes through, okay, we got a line that goes down, and we reintroduce it back into the block. Okay? So whatever liquid oil comes out of this thing, this hose on top of the valve cover goes to my filter. So from the valve cover vent, where liquid oil would accumulate, it travels through a hose, into the filter, down this drain hose, and gets reintroduced back into the block. And this is the top of my starter motor right here. So there's a little tube sticking out of the block that any liquid vapors that comes through the crankcase, the valve cover breather, gets reintroduced back into the block. That's your near zero engine. Emissions wise, they put steel pistons in them and they did a couple other little things. But for emissions, that's what they did. Yep.
I got confused. Did you say that it has two catalytic converters or it has two sensors?
Two sensors, one converter. One before the converter that actually looks at the engine's exhausts and what's going on there, and that sensor will send major fueling adjustment data to the ECM. The one after the catalytic converter will tell the ECM if the catalytic converter is functioning. Some newer engines, your Volvos, Jeff, use that second converter further, that second O2 sensor, to further trim the fuel. Okay, so one converter, two sensors. All right, let's take about a 10-minute break. We'll come back through and we'll go through ignition. I need my nap.